Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, everybody. So I'm Dave Watson. I'm at Charles Sturt University. I'm a professor of ecology and one of a group of people investigating the application of acoustic monitoring at very large scale, at a continental scale. So this is just to give you all a little window into the overall project and some initial results on how things are going. So you walk into a forest and the first thing you are struck by is sound. Now, ecologists love to measure things. We love to put things in boxes, and most of us do that in terms of species. Not all species make sounds, but many of them do. So our motivation in this work is to capture a lot of that information that's happening all around us, store it, and allow other people to use it for all sorts of different applications. Now, many of you realise that you can depict sound visually as sonograms. There's a range of birds that we're just calling, little twitterings, yellow-faced honeyeater there, more drawn-out calls of a crow, and little chiming calls of something like a pardalote up in the canopy. That's familiar technology to I'm sure, all of you. My group has been interested in longer duration recordings, and the minute you start doing longer duration recordings, you need to come up with different ways of visualizing that kind of information. So the top trace there, the gray, that's just a regular sonogram of 24 hours, and that's really not that meaningful. That's a lot of information compressed, and there's not much you can get out of that. But using false color spectrograms, a technique that a postdoc in the group, Mike Towsey, has developed, using 3 different acoustic indices and making them a color, you can then start to see some really interesting patterns emerge in these long duration recordings. So you can go back to those same species and over long duration, now remember this is 24 hours, you can see all sorts of interesting traces. So the of a Teresian crow, because they call a lot during the day, you can see that emerging quite nicely in this long duration recording. So that's over about half an hour. And same with many other birds that are called repeatedly. You can see species-specific traces on these long duration recordings. Now that's fun because many people are interested in species scale identifications. Many of you will be aware there's apps. There's the Frog ID app in Australia. There's apps for cicadas, for bats. You can use this information to drill down to species level stuff. And it's not just animals. I would encourage many of you to read this book, Songs of Trees. David Haskell can identify dozens of different species of trees by their sound. He can place a microphone under a tree, and pines, hemlocks, maples all make distinctively different sounds. So this isn't just an animal thing. You can also use these sorts of visualizations for other things. You can see some harmonics there of crickets during the nighttime, cicadas. Sorry, that's in the morning. Crickets in the morning, cicadas in the nighttime. There's a jet. There's an airport near where this sensor is. You can see jet engines appearing. So starting to see these visualizations, we got quite excited about what we could do at scale. So you pull back. There's a bunch of 24-hour recordings, all lined up, concatenated series of ribbon plots. And there's this pink stuff. We didn't know what that was. It's like, well, what's this? That's a bit too weird that's a bit too high for insects. It's a bat. It's a bat we didn't even know occurred at this forest site, the tube-nosed bat, quite an obscure blossom-feeding bat. And so it goes to show that when you start deploying technology, you start looking at things in new ways, you find things that you didn't even know were there. And so that looking beyond this particular 24-hour type scheme, we can start to build up long duration data sets. So here's 9 months. Just give you a moment. That's 9 months of data on one panel. Each pixel is a minute of data. The predominant frequency of sound at that time is color coded there using those false color spectrograms. And you can start to see all sorts of things. You can start to see storms and wind in the summer. You can see the dawn chorus shifting as the season rolls on from summer into autumn. You can see the cicadas I pointed out. They're peaking in the autumn and summer, and then falling away later on in the year. You can do some really fun things with these large data sets. So that's what inspired us to take this to scale. Rather than one forest site, one sensor over months, let's do hundreds of sensors across the continent over years. Now, I'm the person talking to you. This is not just my show. I'm one of a group of researchers, 5 researchers working in this space across multiple universities. And here's how we're going with it. So the magic number is 400. 400 is a big number to some people. That's the number of sensors we're deploying. It's a very small number if you're thinking about keeping tabs on an entire continent. So we're about 3/4 of the way through the rollout. There are 100 sensors, but there's 400 sensors, but that's at 100 sites. So each site gets 4 sensors, 2 in wet sites, 2 in dry sites, and they're stratified by productivity. So there's some redundancy built in there. We're making the recordings at 22 kilohertz with a 16-bit dynamic range and onboard storage. Let me just show you this machine. Well, I'll get to that in a sec. Very large data sets. So we're talking about 2 petabytes worth of data around that ballpark, and it's cloud-based, open access. Anybody can access any recordings to do whatever they want with. So here's the machines themselves. I've got one to show you if you can see this. So here's, so that's the machine. It's quite a large device. It can be mounted on a star picket. There's a battery in there. Where can I show you? Here we go. Yep. So there's the battery. There's the sensor. There's slots for 4 onboard storage of SD cards. So there's about 1 terabyte of storage on board with a solar panel. So it's self-powering. It can sit there for a year and record continuously during that time. But a person physically has to come over and swap out those SD cards on a duty cycle of either every 6 months or every year, and then we upload that information to the cloud. So I want to give you a little window to how this is going. We're still installing sensors. Not that much data has come back in yet, but here's some data from a bunch of sensors we deployed back in 2014, some of the prototypes. And I just want to alert you to the fact that Australia is quite a large place, but there's very, very few people there. So if you look at this yellow, this sort of pale tan, that's where there's effectively less than, it's almost uninhabited. So from a logistics point of view for ecological monitoring, just going to these places can be the most expensive bit. Once you get there, it's actually quite easy to do things. So it's a really nice application for acoustic monitoring. You go there once, you set up your gear, you walk away, you go home, and data is still being collected. So it's a really useful way at scale to monitor quite efficiently. But then you have this issue of very large data sets, and how do you find that needle in the haystack? How do you find that particular species you're after, if that's the question you're asking? So we thought, let's come up with quite a tricky test. This is a particular bird called a pied honeyeater. Alan Keast, one of the early ecologists that thought long and hard about Australian birds, called this animal an ultra-nomad. They come, they go, they appear, they disappear, unclear what beat they're dancing to. Mysterious birds that live in the vast interior of Australia, that travel long distances, have breeding aggregations, and then disappear again. So we used sensors along these arid zone creek lines to look for them, and they pop out quite nicely. This little box here, so that's what they sound like, that's their call, and it pops up quite nicely. They call all day long, so when they're there and they're calling, you can pick them up quite easily. And so we did this. One of my students went through 12 and a half years of continuous acoustic data, and that took 17 hours. So, and that's not with a recognizer, that's not with any particular groovy software, that's just using this particular visualization to display things. And then another student used remote sensing data to tally up rainfall in these desert sites and show that there's periods of green where the area greens up, and what do you know, that coincides with when these birds are appearing. So they're not there, there's a rainfall event, the birds appear, Not that surprising when you remember that these birds feed on a particular kind of plant. They're nectar feeders. That plant responds to those rainfall events. So purely remotely, setting up these machines and then walking away and then using satellite derived data, we can get some pretty intelligent information about comings and goings of an animal and in response to, in this case, a particular resource. We can go one better and look at calling rate. And this is just as a function of time since rain. And we see that after a particular rain event, calling rate increases, and that's consistent with breeding. So with a little bit of ecological intelligence here, rather than just randomly stumbling around this giant data set, we can ask some pretty intelligent questions and drill right down to what we're interested in. So using a magnet to find the needle in the haystack. Now, I'm an ecologist. I study plants and animals. That's my primary interest. This data is going to be useful for many, many other things. Remember, it's open access and it's 24/7. It's recording right now. So there's many places in Australia where there aren't weather stations. So tracking storms, tracking electrical activity, seismic activity, lots of other things other than living things make sound that these sensors will be picking up. Many of you will understand Australia's just had a pretty severe, well, an unprecedented fire season. 20% of our forests are now looking like that. Acoustic monitoring is a wonderful application for measuring responses to that kind of catastrophe at scale, at regional, continental scales. And so we're rolling out a lot of sensors in those fire grounds, this week. And then finally, just to leave you with, sound and listening are powerful ways of communicating. Many of our apparent leaders aren't necessarily that good at listening, but capturing sounds from the natural world, storing them indefinitely, so allowing future researchers to ask questions that we haven't even thought of before is going to, I think, becoming an increasingly powerful way to empower community, stakeholder groups, citizens around the world to ask questions directly about things that are of interest to them and demand more intelligent policy responses from our apparent leaders. So I'm going to leave my talk there. Happy to have questions.
That was awesome. Thank you. You had a heap of questions come through while you were speaking. There were a couple specifically around bushfires, so I'll pick them up first. Dimitri was wondering, are you able to, Dimitri's about to speak, are you able to tell the effect of the forest fires before and after? I know you touched on it, but, and connected to that is how many sensors actually survived the fires, or are you deploying afterwards?
Okay, great question. So we had a bunch of sensors that were scheduled to be in areas that burned. None of them were put out at that time. So we didn't lose any gear. So no sensors were destroyed. The before-after comparisons, there are some areas that were fire adjacent where the sensors were recording pre-fire, and then we're going to be able to look at post-fire stuff. But really, at that scale, we're talking maybe a dozen data points. So I don't think that's enough to say meaningfully this is the response of this system to fire. And unfortunately, there's very few other data sets around. There's some bird groups, some mammal researchers have decent before data, but that's at this particular place, this particular reserve, at scale in terms of whole populations. It's guesswork, and so I'm on the committee that advises the federal government on threatened birds. We're really worried about dozens of species that previously weren't on our radar at all, that weren't listed. But that's purely based on extent of fire. Follow-up surveys are starting to happen now, but it's quite dangerous because there's a lot of branches and trees falling, roads aren't passable. So we're still in the early stages of post-fire monitoring.
Which kind of brings me to a question. Why was 400 the magic number?
Oh, look, it was pretty much just, yep, seems about right. We got a grant from the feds to do this, and that's, once you start dividing up the money, you need to make some pretty tough decisions. We made tough decisions about sampling rates, the resolution of the recordings we were recording, and storage. About half the budget was storage of this acoustic data. So 400 was a start. This is not the end. This is not the finished product. This is an advanced prototype. We're intending to go back to the federal government in about 5-6 years, once the data is all there, once people are starting to do things with it, not just scientists, educators, artists. We foresee many different kinds of applications with this acoustic data. We then intend to go back to the federal government to say, look, if you want us to do this properly, let's talk thousands of sensors.
Amazing. There were a lot of questions that were coming in around the analysis and the spectrograms that you pulled up, and Alice kindly dropped a link for people to find out more. But Ben, do you have a mic?
Yeah, I do. I was just wondering to what extent your large team has dedicated computer science and deep learning partners, and whether this is something that the ecologists were saying, hey, let's collect the data and then we'll find partners, or whether you have a set of team that's already sort of working on that aspect of it.
Yeah, great question. Most of the team are computer scientists. So they're pale-skinned people. They think in ones and zeros. So yes, totally. They're very excited by this. They've been working on this for quite a while. That's not at all to say they have all the tricks up their sleeve, especially when it comes to visualizing months of continuous data, let alone years. It hasn't been done before at scale. So we're very much still feeling our way in terms of what can we do. But that's why we're making this open access. We're not being proprietary about this. It's like, if you want to play in this space, go for it.
Ben, since you're on the line, it's a question that's come up quite often. It's already come up in this chat about how do we get the machine learning part of the world involved in the ecology world. Do you have any thoughts about
so I mean, we're sort of trying to create this community a little bit. It's very difficult in the sense that there's a different set of goals among the researchers in terms of both publication and financial goals. But there are little things starting to pop up. I posted in the Slack channel, that I help run a Slack channel for AI for conservation that's loosely connected to Microsoft's AI for Earth grant. And so I was thinking that if David didn't already have a partner, we could talk to Lucas Joppa at Microsoft AI for Earth and see if there's interested partners, but it sounds like he's well covered. But I would say that we're starting to build a bit of community, and so to what extent there are open data sources and trying to define a specific problem that you need help with, that usually helps people get engaged with it versus saying, here's a massive data set. We find that the computer scientists really need to be targeted in a very specific way, like, I am looking for this species at this time, and that really helps crystallize the problem.
Great. We're on the same page.
Ben, what's your background? Oh, you're a researcher in deep learning.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Weinstein. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm in the US. I work in deep learning for ecology. And so audio is not what I do. I do object detection, but it just felt like time to jump on. But if anyone has questions about the Slack channel or AI for Earth, I'm a grant recipient, or National Geographic, I'm a grant recipient there too. So if people need help, just message me offline. Thanks.
Can I ask a silly question, both of Ben and, sorry, Ben, you're now in this.
Yeah, now I'm here. I'm really here now.
Given that a lot of machine learning in ecology tends to be, and conservation tends to be focused on camera traps and the visual side of things, the way you're presenting your data, David, is visually, right? It's not sound analysis. Well, it's not, and yeah. Does that mean the same tools and the algorithms can be pulled across, or is it a big jump, or is it something completely different still?
There's massive crossover there, and so the recognizes that Michael's now building a vector-based, and a lot of them are visual classifiers. So yes, and I guess I should say that my group is not, even though I used some species examples, my group isn't that focused on species-specific stuff. We're much more interested in whole of soundscape analysis, using the sound of an entire system to say things about phenology, to say things about ecosystem health, say things about change through time and comparisons between sites. So we're blurring our eyes regarding species. So a lot of the work we're doing is at that broader scale rather than critter by critter. But we've been quite surprised at just how useful. These visualizations can be for particular kinds of single species, and the trick there is sort of a marriage between the distinctive properties of the vocalizations of the organism itself, but also the acoustic theatre around the call, when it's calling, who else is calling around it. So if it's calling at a time or a place where there's not much else in that band, in that frequency band, then it just pops right out. And visually, it's quite easy to isolate, identify. Yeah, that's a brief answer.
Ben, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say is that in general, audio seems to be often transformed into the spectrographs for visual analysis. And so in some ways, you're sort of looking at the picture of the image, of the audio. I will say that, you know, deep learning models need a tremendous amount of data. And so while there is a tremendous amount of unlabeled data here, having really strong labeled data is important. And so you tend to pre-train on image classifiers that are well annotated, and then try to port that learning to the specific system in mind. And so the extent that we can use you know, object detection things like it's a dog, it's a cat, to then transfer the learn to the audio signatures of a particular species is a really open and interesting question. And it sort of falls in this multimodality. And I know the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is currently working on that particular question. And if anyone knows Grant Van Horn, that's something that people are working on right now. And so it's a really active area of work, and just having huge amounts of unlabeled data is just a very exciting thing. And I think David's team is doing a great job there.
Awesome. Well, you've offered a beautiful segue into our next speaker, who is from Cornell University. Thank you very much, David. We'll bring you back in 15 or so minutes when we join the group discussion.